Let's look at another amazing Indian weapon that some of you may not have even heard of. It is the hooded Katar. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now, I've featured Katar, we'll come back to the hooded one in a second, many times on this channel, frankly, because they're awesome. I've got various examples. I picked 3 different ones here. So here's one with a earlier blade. This is a triangular section blade. I have featured this one before. And the Katar is defined essentially by having this capital H shaped style grip, or hilt if you want to call it that. And sometimes they have 1 bar, sometimes multiple bars, 2 or 3 or even 4 bars across here. The langets, if we call them that, the kind of bars that come up the side of the hand and wrist, take various different forms. And we can often identify these Katar to different particular parts of India and different periods. Now, the Katar itself is a very important Indian weapon. Anyway, most of the examples that would be featured on this channel are essentially 15th, 16th century at the earliest onwards. So in fact, we're going to talk about 16th century hooded Katars in a second. So the Indian Katar, very important weapon, and in many ways it fulfilled kind of partly like the role of a rondel dagger. So here's another example here. I'll just put that one down. And this is a different style, you will see. And this is in fact a very large one, very big one, but it's incredibly thick blade. Now, I've talked about these armor piercing points before in previous videos. So very often these were a backup weapon worn in the sash. They'd be in a scabbard in the sash as a backup weapon to the sword. So in that case, it's quite similar to knights and men-at-arms in medieval Europe, for example, where they would have a primary weapon like a spear or a poleaxe or a lance on horseback. Then they would have the sword as their sort of primary sidearm, as it were, their backup weapon, but their primary sidearm. And then this would be the tertiary weapon. But in addition to that, these were sometimes primary weapons because sometimes you would go somewhere where you weren't wearing a sword. So, for example, there might be certain social situations where it wasn't the done thing to walk around with a lance or even to wear a sword, but you would wear one of these. So, as well as being important as a weapon for penetrating armor and in grappling and wrestling distance, we'll come back to that in a second, they also had a symbolic kind of role to play as well, and were characteristically Indian. They were really absolutely native to the Indian subcontinent. We don't really find them outside of India. You don't really even find them in Nepal or Afghanistan, you know, neighboring areas. As far as I know, you don't even really find them in Ceylon or Sri Lanka either, or Burma. So these were a kind of ethnically specific weapon to the Indian subcontinent. That being said, as you will see, there are different styles of Katar, and some of these are more associated with certain groups of people with India. India is a big place, always has been, and it's got a lot of people in it, and it's got a lot of different cultures. Obviously, modern India has several different religions, but even if we go back to the 16th century, you've got primarily Hindus and Muslims, you've also got Sikhs, and you've got various other people there as well. But even within those, there are different groupings, there are different empires, different kingdoms, and they were all ethnically, to some degree, defined and distinct from each other. So they didn't all wear the same type of headwear, they didn't all wear the same type of clothes, and they didn't carry all exactly the same type of weapons. So while in India they all had Katars, they weren't all exactly the same style of Katar. So there are some that we recognise as being more from the north, some more from the south, some more from the east, and so on and so forth. Right. So this one is a great example of one which is clearly designed for punching through armour, specifically mail. So primarily the armour of India in this period was either forms of fabric armour or mail, aka chainmail. They did have plate armour, but plates usually were restricted in size. So sometimes you might have a plate in the middle of the breast, obviously you'd have a plate helmet. Sometimes there were like a bazuban type, Persian type forearm protectors and stuff like this. So sometimes they did have plates in addition to mail, but there were large gaps between the plates, and between those gaps, and on most of the body, was a mail shirt, sometimes full mail sleeves and legs and the whole lot, and kind of curtains down the side of the Kulakud style helmet. So the most of the armour that you're aiming at penetrating is mail. So this square type tip, very similar to what we find on rondel daggers, is designed for compromising armour. Right, and as I mentioned, just to give one other example, this is probably my favourite, most prized one. You'll see that this one has gold Koftgari all over it. This is a higher status one, and that is a much broader blade, but you'll see it still has that very thick reinforced point. Not to say that all of them have stiff reinforced points. In fact, some of them, like this one, actually has quite a slender point, but it's triangular section, so that will still go through mail. It's just not quite as robust. It's a little bit longer, but it's a little bit more fragile than these very wide reinforced tips here, incredibly reinforced. So quite specialised weapons. Obviously, primarily you're punching with them, so we could call this a punch dagger or push dagger. But anyway, nevertheless, so by the time we get to the 16th century, there are several distinct types of katar. And now we're going to look at the hooded variety as featured here. Now this is a type which seems to have come about in the 16th century. That's the 1500s AD, okay? But most of these hooded examples, or at least the early hooded examples, this isn't an early one, this is a later one, but most of the early hooded katar examples are from southern India, and I'll come back to that in a second, and they are from the late 16th century and 17th century. Okay, so the late 1500s and the 1600s. That's when these really seem to be in their heyday and incredibly popular in southern India. So that's when we come on to the Vijayanagara, I'm sure I'm pronouncing that wrong, please, any Indian viewers correct me on this, Vijayanagara Empire. Okay, so the Vijayanagara Empire is essentially a Hindu empire in the south of India. Why is this important? Well, when we look at the history of weapons and the development of weapons, what's happening in the environment, the context, is incredibly important to the kind of rise of these distinctive weapon forms. And it's the same in Europe, Africa, America, doesn't matter where you look. So in India, the Vijayanagara Empire was a Hindu empire in the south of India. Now, why is it important that that's in the south of India and that it's Hindu? Quite simply because in the 16th century and in fact going all the way back into the 15th century, there were large-scale Muslim incursions into northern India. And essentially leading to the foundation of the Mughal Empire. So the Mughals were essentially an Islamic empire. So India is a big place, lots of different religions, and it has to be pointed out, you can't avoid the fact that in the 15th and 16th century, particularly the 16th century I would say, India is very much the product of Islamic incursion. And this is when we see the kind of growth of Sikhism, for example. So the Sikhs and the Muslims at this time are facing this invasion, this Muslim invasion, and it's not necessarily an invasion of people, but a cultural and religious movement invasion into India, and they react accordingly by forming into strong militaristic powers, and in many cases developing distinctive weapons that are part and parcel of the fact that they are sort of coalescing into strong kingdoms and empires and cultures to resist this new culture coming in. So if you look for hooded katar online, for example, you'll find lots of antique examples that are from the Vijayanagara part of India, but it's really an empire, a culture, a region of the south of India. And they are very, very distinctive because you'll see, although the basic idea is the same as a typical katar, okay, the construction, the arrangement of the bars, everything else, the really characteristic feature is this big hooded guard on the back. Now, why does it have that? I can't fully answer that question, but I can surmise based on what I can see from the originals. So if we look at the original hooded katars, the earliest ones, we'll see that they are very often married to quite large blades. And so I think what happened is there was a need for swords or large weapons at this time. And in some cases, full ass sword blades. Now, something that's really interesting in southern India is because of the sort of triangular shape of India, southern India seems to have had more extensive contact with the outside world through trade. So we actually find an awful lot of blades in southern India and indeed in places like Sri Lanka, are influenced by and sometimes directly use the blades which were bought in trade from people like the Spanish, the Portuguese, and so on and so forth, mostly Spanish and Portuguese actually. And so it's quite, if we go to Sri Lanka, for example, which is off the south coast of India, then we actually see swords which are very clearly influenced, I mean, based on the castain, clearly, to me, influenced by 16th century European swords. Now, I'm not saying this is a distinctively Indian weapon. So what I'm not saying is I'm not saying that the hooded katar is necessarily a product of European contact. I'm not trying to claim, plant a flag for, you know, European ingenuity. And I think it's a completely Indian invention. However, what we do find is some blades being produced in the south of India were German, Spanish, Portuguese imports, sometimes Italian. And I think, therefore, that also affected the production of some of the other blades on native Indian-made swords at the time. Anyway, that's partly my supposition. I think more research needs to be done on that. I'm not sure whether there's even enough data to come to any fixed conclusions about that. But the fact is that many of these have large blades on them, like this blade, but even longer, usually with multiple fullers. So the reason I think this is a later one is this doesn't have the multiple fullers, it doesn't have the characteristic braid. I suspect that this is a 18th, 19th century katar in the style of the earlier ones. Anyway, we'll come back to that in a second. The earlier ones have larger, longer blades, and sometimes, as I say, really big, long blades, like we find on the pata, which is perhaps a related weapon. I've talked about pata in other videos. Now, what's also interesting is sometimes this hood has connecting bars at the side, so it's kind of like a basket hilt. Now, I'm not saying any connection with European basket hilts or anything like that, but what we've ended up with at this point is more of a battlefield weapon. Now, within the context of southern India and Muslim expansion in the north and, you know, rivaling empires and stuff, I suspect what happened is people took the humble katar, the dagger katar, that was used as a thing that you stuff through your sash and is a backup weapon, and made them into bigger, more militaristic, more bellicose versions. So I think that's what we're seeing here. We're seeing something with a bigger, more substantial hilt, easier to grip onto in war, more hand protection, obviously to protect the hands. They didn't wear gauntlets in India for the most part at this point. There was something similar to a gauntlet, but anyway, maybe we'll look at those in a future video. And bigger blades. Okay, so essentially these were a bit like, you could say, things like the Langmesser. You could see something that grows out of a more civilian sort of everyday carry type into becoming something you actually take on the battlefield. And I think that's what we're seeing. So they're a really, really fascinating subset of katar, and they are the biggest variety of katar. They also have the best hand protection, and they're fantastic weapons. Now, a lot of people will say to me, what do I think of it as a weapon? I think they're absolutely awesome. They've got all the advantages of a katar, primarily for thrusting, but obviously you could cut with it as well, but with a hell of a lot more hand protection. The disadvantage is they're obviously bigger and more inconvenient to wear, and that's one of the main reasons why I think that they grew as a soldier's weapon, as a militaristic version of this. And perhaps for people who couldn't afford a talwar or a, you know, kanda or patissa or one of the larger Indian swords. And there are multiple reasons as well why you might want soldiers to carry a smaller weapon rather than a longer weapon. It might be that they're operating artillery or on ships or this kind of stuff. So really, really great. Like virtually without parallel in the world. I think there's no other culture in the world which has invented, really, I mean, we've got punch daggers and push daggers in other cultures, but not really like the katar. And we certainly in no other culture really have anything that's like the hooded katar. They're completely distinctive. As I say, normally they have multiple fuller blades. Usually they're slightly bigger blades than this. The fact that this is a flat blade and the fact that, notice, it's got that reinforced tip like the other later period katar, the 18th century katars here. I suspect that this is actually a, possibly even from another region, this is a later, probably I would say 18th, 19th century version of the earlier 16th, 17th century hooded katars. Anyway, that's been a very quick run through. There's a lot more we could say about the various empires and kingdoms and conflicts of India in the 16th century. Much like Japan in the 16th century, or you could say much like Europe in the 16th century, this is an intensely interesting part of history. And if you're interested in learning a new bit of military history, have a look at what was going on in India in the 16th century. Huge artillery being used, amazing variety of weapons and armour, clashes of religions, Hindu, Muslim, Sikh, kingdoms rising and falling. It's an absolutely fascinating period, and whenever we get this sort of historical period where you get these huge clashes of ideas and technology and territory kind of struggles, then you get very interesting weapons to go with it. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching. I have been Matt Easton, and a special thanks to Gavin Locke for lending me this, because this is actually his rather than mine. I have been Matt Easton, I will continue to be, of course, and I hope I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.